I'm excited to talk to you. And again, thank you for the time. A lot of changes at the FDA. And I think to start, it would just be helpful for me to get your understanding of the current state of the FDA now, within the last quarter or so, and all the changes that have taken place. What's going on at the FDA, and what's the foundation there now for companies, investors to really understand moving forward?
If I had to summarize it, the state of the FDA is one of disruption that needs to be actively managed. If you're a CEO of an early stage company or running a large multinational with a large U.S. market presence, this is not business as usual at the FDA. We were talking earlier that the initial presidential actions were noteworthy, but relatively modest, at about 10% cut in staffing. And my initial reaction was that if there are no additional cuts, no additional disruptive activities, this may be an opportunity for the FDA to lean out, right size, and actually meet or exceed some timeline goals for reviews. Since then, things have changed. So the actions on a range of fronts have gotten more dramatic, so that and quantifiable, so that an early stage company has to dedicate time in a few different areas to manage FDA risk. One area of FDA risk is timelines. So if you're submitting an IDE, I can nearly guarantee with 100% confidence that the FDA will respond within the 30-day legislative timeline, because that has direct impact on patients. So the IDE is the document, is the application to permit study in humans. But if you're involved in a pre-submission, like one of our recent clients, what was a face-to-face may move to a Zoom. What was a Zoom may move to written feedback. And even more significant, we had a client who was initially planning for a Zoom. It got moved to written feedback. And then the clarifying interaction got staggered over multiple weeks. So the question may be for the folks viewing this as early stage management, should I budget and put in buffer of days, weeks, months, somewhere between weeks and months for delays in FDA communication if you're not in a high priority application type area? If you're working on a PMA, which is a high risk device that's life sustaining or life supporting, the FDA likely will continue to prioritize that. But there are some application types like 513Gs that I wouldn't count on them being as timely as they have been in the past.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I mean, I agree. Initially, earlier this year, when 10% cut, okay, perhaps it was a little bloated, and perhaps this will help streamline things and make it more efficient, and that could actually lead to a better experience for founders and companies who are submitting to the FDA, streamline processes, et cetera. But now with more broader cuts, and like you said, having to manage prioritization now with limited resources moving forward, it's a really interesting time to be in the med device space, to be submitting to the FDA. And when it comes to just internally at the FDA, I imagine morale probably has taken a hit to a certain extent. And given that the FDA's mandate, or not necessarily FDA's mandate, but as it relates to medical devices, safety and effectiveness, right? Mm-hmm. The two things we're concerned about here. Do you foresee any challenges moving forward with the remaining individuals at the FDA and morale, and how that might affect reviews or standards and qualities and guidance moving forward?
The perennial question for most companies, and most companies in the MedTech industry have one product that they're trying to get through the FDA so they can grow and become a big company like Medtronic. The perennial question is, will my reviewer change from my pre-sub to my IDE to my de novo application? And the FDA for years has been laser-like focused on maintaining that consistency. That's the first disruption I think one can anticipate, where people have left and will continue to leave from the folks on probation in a probationary period who were let go, then rehired. Our firm is having conversations with those people who did not sign up for that type of activity and are looking to leave. So there's going to be an exodus of those people who many of them were lead reviewers. And then from a policy perspective, we're also having conversations with people who I started out at the agency with, who have 20 plus years of experience, who are at more senior levels and who are involved in making sure that the decisions across product types, different areas are consistent. And those people have enough financial stability where they are thinking about an exodus. So you have those two types of people who are leaving. So what does a company do to manage that? Maintain open and regular communication with the FDA and express as background. For example, our lead reviewer was John Doe. We would welcome the opportunity to continue working with John Doe for consistency's sake and control what you can control as a company. But I would say, AJ, to answer your question directly, if I were an early stage company CEO or CEO of any size, actually, I would plan for the rest of 2025 to have disruptions in reviewers, in timelines, and also guidances. And we could talk about that more. But that's what I think 2025 will look like for sure.
Okay, excellent.
We talked about morale. While without a doubt, I was fortunate enough to work with a group of professionals at the FDA for 12 years. And they are consummate professionals. This magnitude and breadth of disruption, I believe, is having an impact on morale. Having said all of that, because it's such a mission-focused organization, the staff still come in every day to do a job, and they will do it to the best of their ability, even with that morale hanging over them.
As it relates to guidance and the changes at the FDA, what should we expect and how should we process anything coming down the pipe in that regard moving forward?
So one of the reasons why the FDA is considered the gold standard for regulatory bodies throughout the world in general is because the quantity and quality of the guidance and regulations that they promulgate and the recent presidential action and executive order to mandate for every one guidance that you want to promulgate, it can be a guidance or a regulation, 10 have to be rescinded, will dramatically and significantly reduce the amount of guidance that can be promulgated for the types of data that companies need to produce for a marketing approval or de novo granting or 510K. So the short answer is it's a net negative in terms of clarity and quantity of documents to guide companies for data requirements for applications. And this impacts everything from AI/ML products that are embedded in electromechanical systems to software as a medical device to diagnostics. What can one do? Startups will essentially be negotiating the data requirements either through interactive review when they submit their marketing application or through pre-submissions where they're having a formal conversation about the bench, animal, and clinical data needed for their application type. That's what we can expect given this edict.
I guess looking at it from an investor perspective as well, because obviously MedTech Impact Partners doing great work there. You also invest with Wavemaker Three-Sixty Health. Looking at it from an investor standpoint, how do you process some of these changes as well as you're looking at it not only on the regulatory side, but looking at it from a startup perspective, but now an investor perspective as well?
So over the last several months, I've been fortunate enough to talk to investors that are active MedTech investors. Obviously, we interact with early stage and large MedTech companies on a weekly basis. And the message that I'm receiving is companies will continue to attract and raise capital, maybe on an elongated regulatory and clinical timeline. That's one. Value will still continue to be created through bridge rounds, and investors should continue to ask for de-risked regulatory timelines but expect a double click. Expect buffer placed in there for the savvy MedTech company. And if the MedTech company that you're dealing with still has the same timeline from 2 quarters ago, it may be a signal that they're not really paying attention, or they're not really in close enough touch with the FDA to properly manage expectations. I think that investors will continue to deploy capital. Some of them still may have capital that they raised from LPs from 2020, 2021, and those LPs still want to return. And they still have to hit a net IRR that's attractive for their next fund. Unless they're an evergreen fund, then, God bless them. But for most investors that I interact with, they're going to continue to invest, but continue to have conversations about that FDA timeline. And what comes up time and time again is breakthrough designation. And even though this is not an area that our firm works on specifically, reimbursement and monetization will become even more crisply and clearly into focus, even when companies are raising a Series A. Definitely Series B, but generally speaking, those conversations will happen earlier.
Interesting. So even with the changes, not necessarily expecting a net negative impact on innovation at the earliest stages of medtech, or is that something that is still TBD as it relates to?
I would say it's TBD. I would say at best it will be best it will be slight net positive, or worst case neutral.
Okay.
Because fundamentally, venture investing mandates that you get money out the door. And there are still great companies with great IP that have to get through the FDA. One question that an investor had for us recently was, for AI/ML, since the FDA has in some ways retreated from their activity to regulate AI/ML on the clip that they used to, will there be other bodies that stand up or emerge to take the place of the FDA or complement the FDA? And the answer is, at best, they would be a complement. This is my answer to the FDA, and maybe fill a void that the FDA has seeded. But fundamentally, the FDA still will have to characterize and assess safety and effectiveness for AI/ML software and AI/ML in medical devices. It may be slower. Some of the questions may be not as sophisticated, but fundamentally, and we all know that AI/ML is a megatrend, companies will still need to interact with the FDA, even if there are other nonprofits or quasi-governmental looking agencies that try and fill the void.
What's the current experience for companies that are pursuing FDA regulatory approval for AI/ML on the software side and also on the hardware side today, at least?
Right now, before the disruption, one would definitely get questions around how are you managing changes in your software? And there is a guidance called PCCP to help companies with describing how changes will be managed and which ones would necessitate a new marketing application. And there was a group of AI/ML experts that would add their questions, and there's cybersecurity experts that would ask those questions. The AI/ML expertise has been a bit diminished. There was a Center for Digital Excellence, which has been a bit diminished, so that the quality and quantity of those questions may have gone down a bit. The cybersecurity questions we have been observing are consistent. Those continue to come. And whether you're a standalone software as a medical device or SIMD software in a medical device, there still will be a battery of questions that you can expect along those lines. As a matter of fact, we're working with a firm right now. We're working with multiple firms that are working through cybersecurity testing that the FDA has consistently asked.
That's very interesting. Tell me a little bit about MedTech Impact Partners and how you all work with founders specifically, and also other key stakeholders within the ecosystem.
We've been working with early stage companies for nearly 8 years now. and 60% of the companies that we work with are early stage. And specifically, we work with them when they have one very specific question. Is my device regulated? Yes or no? We can answer that in a very focused way. Everything from that to we want a comprehensive regulatory strategy where we want to understand not only is my device regulated, how is it regulated, what would be the testing needed, what would be the relevant standards, guidance, et cetera, what is the timeline, what are the relative costs associated with it. We can be a thought partner there and provide that information. And we can also support with companies who are dealing with oftentimes very thorny questions around de novos or PMAs, and consider questions like, for this human factors test, can I leverage OUS data? Can I leverage this device and another on the other end of the spectrum in edge testing, or do I have to have representative devices across the spectrum? We work through those questions when companies absolutely need to get that de novo or PMA or even 510K through the FDA. And that's mainly how we've been working with companies for our history.
Okay, excellent. And I guess when it comes to just double tapping on like regulatory strategy, that comprehensive strategy that you work with these companies on, what does that entail, and why is that absolutely critical for early stage companies, especially in this current environment?
So what we've come to appreciate is the clients we work with want to understand to a high level of granularity the timeline for regulatory, quality, clinical, and even reimbursement so they can tell that story to funders. And they want an objective third person. Sometimes we work with companies that have in-house director of regulatory. Sometimes we work with companies that have an in-house VP of regulatory and clinical, but they want an additional set of eyes and sense of security from a team that's worked at the FDA to say specifically, these are all the elements that we think are necessary to get you from concept or prototype all the way through FDA and beyond. And again, we work with companies with all types of configurations, from ones with no regulatory or quality and they want to outsource that, to they have mid-level experience regulatory leadership or senior level regulatory leadership. Either way, we can provide value based on the needs of that company at that particular stage. But in this environment, the disruptions at the FDA have necessitated a clear and authoritative voice regarding what will be needed based on decades of experience. And that's what we provide.
So just to jump back into the FDA specifically quickly, I guess a general question I have is, how reliable are the safety and effectiveness guidance and standards moving forward now that it's kind of in flux? And how, again, should founders prepare to ensure that they could validate and verify their safety and effectiveness?
So we rely on credible, objective sources of information to augment what we do individually, which is to track guidances and regulations, because there have been guidances that we've observed that have been taken from the FDA website and then put back or changed. And between the expertise in-house at our firm, incredible sources that we regularly monitor, we can give you up to the day intelligence on what is relevant. It wasn't like that 4 months ago. 4 months ago, if there was guidance posted on the FDA's website and it was final, you could have high confidence that it was not going to be taken down off the website, withdrawn, rescinded. That is not the case anymore. So either companies need that internal regulatory intelligence capability, or they should outsource it, and it should be part of management discussions, management meetings on a monthly basis at a minimum.
But is it a point along the journey at which it's too early to engage with a third party, or is there an ideal time to engage?
you can be working with a third party as early as a concept stage. And generally when it's at the concept stage, a regulatory quality firm can help you navigate and explore options between one version of your product versus another with indication A versus indication B. And that's a common way that we engage with companies very early. The only time it's too early, AJ, to engage with the FDA or an outside party is when you're absolutely unclear on your indication statement, your target market, and the claims you want to make. And generally, that's when you're pre-prototype and you have not sat down with your team. And often it can be a team of one or two people, but when you haven't sat down with your team and said, this is the product we want to launch with this indication. And again, even if you're toggling between two, a third party can help you kind of down select to one. But if you have that level of ambiguity, then that's too early. But we find that normally there's a value that we can provide as long as you're past that Rubicon.
I think it might be helpful to focus on like a couple of examples and kind of walk through a hypothetical, right? Covering kind of best practices or areas of extra attention, probably, where founders could perhaps gain efficiency or can get tripped up along the process. Specifically thinking about 510K pathway, and or de novo, or even PMAs, right? So if that's something that would be cool with you,
absolutely,
I think that would be really, really cool to hear from you and just kind of walk down that journey in this hypothetical situation. So
absolutely. So I can think of a couple examples of companies we partner with where they were exploring a product with end indications for use, but wasn't settled, and the indication for use was not settled.
Okay.
And we, based on the indication that was provided to us at the time, provided a regulatory plan, roadmap for the indication that was provided. And when the client got that roadmap, the reaction was to consider alternative paths that maybe will result in a different regulatory application type. And the best case scenarios are when presented with the alternative roadmap, the client selects a path and moves on to the next step, which is generally a pre-submission to talk about clinical data. And then the next step after that, generally speaking, is a marketing application, which could be 510K, de novo, or PMA. Where companies can get stuck is in a do loop, where they keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking an indications for use statement. Now, there sometimes are good reasons for that. You may have a lead investor that absolutely wants to know that the indications for use and the reimbursement strategy and the claims that support the FDA align with how this product can get reimbursed. And until there's alignment, you're going to continue to tweak that indications for use. But sometimes we've worked with companies that engage in a little bit of analysis paralysis. And we've provided the path forward, and it is upon them to down select to get to the next regulatory milestone. And the good news is they have the story for path A or for path B to present to stakeholders. And the bad news is sometimes the company may want to explore path C or path D, and that just slows you up unnecessarily. And obviously, the goal is to get capital to get to your next meaningful milestone. And that requires a certain amount of clarity.
Well, see, that's interesting. So like, what have you observed is the factor that's typically driving that exploration of path C and D when path A and B are here laid out? But what is it that founders or companies are trying to achieve by exploring alternative paths beyond the few that you've laid out?
Yeah. So generally speaking, it's this balance between time and money. And if path A is the most expensive and path B is less expensive by $1 million, let's just say, but doesn't shave you a lot of time off, that CEO may say, is there a path C where I can have my cake and eat it too? I can raise less capital and have a shorter time to market. And that generally is getting into an era where companies may have a product that can fall under enforcement discretion or LDT, which is also had a lot of disruption and ambiguity. But generally, it comes down to time and money. And they want to present to their stakeholders, i.e. their investors, a path that maybe is less capital and more money. Or the flip that we've seen a couple times is we've mapped out a de novo pathway, and that investor says, well, we think you can create more value, and it's a patient investor with a PMA pathway. Come back to us with a PMA pathway. And that obviously is more time and money, but based on a lot of research by a lot of smart people, we know that in general, the most valuable medical device companies are PMA companies. And they take a long time to build, but they're the most valuable companies. But yeah, did that answer your?
No, it does. And it makes sense, right? Because like I said, that's always the fundamental balance, right? Time and money. That's the thing that's driving all of this, right? The two most valuable commodities, right? Time and money. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense too that like PMAs are going to drive the most value because those are net new innovations, right? There's no comparable device in the market. They're exploring something brand new, and if there's actually a market need for it, boom, there you go, right? There's the value creation.
And you know, that makes me think of many digital health companies that we've worked with who toggle between 510K and de novo when they have optionality there. And after multiple conversations, the best pattern that we've seen emerge is when that digital health company has a strategic as an investor that is patient and willing to invest in a de novo company, because to some extent it's still new.
Yeah.
And the key is, and we've seen this with companies that have pharma strategics and medtech strategics, you have someone who is waiting for that Series B, C round and recognizes, because they've just seen many products go through the pipeline, they recognize that there may be a 6-month delay for slow enrollment for a de novo study. But they believe and understand that a de novo fundamentally, on average, is more valuable than a 510K company. Just like a PMA company, on average, is more valuable than a de novo company. And even breakthrough. We've worked with companies so often and so regularly that seek breakthrough that we've written a detailed analysis for why we think breakthrough is still a net positive. Our initial research suggested that, and it still does, that for 510K devices, breakthrough has minimal benefits on timeline, but we've expanded that analysis, particularly for de novos and PMAs, and looked at a range of factors to suggest that BDD is beneficial for factors beyond just time and money. And so that is why, without fail, I've never met an investor that didn't want to ask their company to go for BDD. And I rarely meet a CEO who doesn't want to go for breakthrough. And that's a program that we need to monitor closely because of disruptions at the FDA.
Absolutely. And why is that actually? What is it that the opportunity you're seeing there, especially given the disruptions at the FDA, why that would be a preferential or preferred path?
If I had to simplify it, reimbursement. Because my initial understanding was that BDD unlocked for a small subset of companies, 5 to be exact, automatic reimbursement. That's the pending regulation. And then there was a slight sliver in time where we thought the new CMS director was going to expand that to be unlimited. The last thing I'll say about BDD is, and this is a quote that we have from one of our companies. We interviewed over 100 companies, and one of the interesting quotes was, they're giving away BDD like candy. So the nuance I want to also articulate is you can get your breakthrough designation, but only 10% of companies who have breakthrough designation go on to get their de novo, PMA, or 510K clearance. So BDD is it's not half the battle. It's 10% of the battle. You got to make it to get to that 10% that actually gets the 510K de novo or PMA.
It would be interesting if you could take us into the mind, I guess, of an FDA reviewer.
Mm-hmm.
And once they get the submission, let's say we get through all of these hoops and challenges, we get to the point where, okay, now submission time, we're here, FDA reviewer takes a look. Take us into the mind, I guess, of what an FDA reviewer, their approach, what they're looking for, some of the keys, things of that sort, just from your experience and perspective, just being in the game a long time.
So first of all, it's an exciting time for that reviewer. The lead reviewer is intellectually curious, has a level of expertise that is comparable to their peers in the industry and in other government agencies like the NIH and NSF. So they're intellectually curious and capable in typically a very specific domain. Maybe it's biomedical engineering, maybe it's electrical engineering, maybe it's mechanical engineering. And they will cover both regulatory and scientific inputs, integrate them into an assessment of the safety and effectiveness of that device. I'm perhaps oversimplifying this because all of this takes place over a course of months, where that reviewer is managing probably somewhere between 7 to 15 active applications, and they are able to pull and review the reviews of other reviewers for similar devices to maintain consistency. But this is I would characterize it as an effort to integrate, congeal, and assess input from previous reviews, their team members, and ultimately put together a memo that can be reviewed at least by 2 other managers. But it's fun, AJ. It's a fun process. You are actively engaged in cutting edge technology, and you have to assess at a minimum bench, typically clinical, typically animal and clinical. And when I say bench, it's everything from cybersecurity to biocompatibility to infection control and those types of risks. And you're integrating all that into and triaging between major deficiencies and minor deficiencies. At the agency, there was a time when they were called pocket change. And you're having conversations with your peers over the course of those weeks to get to that initial set of questions for the company. And you are not doing that in a vacuum. Your manager is reviewing those questions to make sure that they are consistent, reasonable, not burdensome, and scientifically rigorous. And even with all the disruptions that we've been talking about, AJ, that fundamental process still takes place. It's very much tied to safety and effectiveness. And it is very much why people sign up for the FDA and stay for 10, 20, 30 years. And there will be also, and the last thing I'll say, AJ, in that process is there will be conversations between that lead reviewer and their direct manager. And sometimes a list of 15 questions maybe gets whittled down to 12, or 15 gets whittled down to 10, because by design, you have at least 2 levels of review before questions go out to a company to, again, ensure consistency, at least burdensome approach, and that each question is tied to safety and effectiveness. That's how the magic happens.
Yeah, absolutely. We're coming up on I guess the end of the conversation, and one thing I think could also be helpful just for some of the early stage founders that are going to hear this is right now, obviously, they're focused on the early stages of the FDA journey, but the journey with the FDA doesn't necessarily end after submission, right? Mm-hmm. And so we'd love for you to highlight kind of the post-submission FDA journey, post-approval FDA journey that founders should start to prepare for now, and some of the best ways that they can prepare for that. So that way, not only when they, successfully submit, but then receive the subsequent approval, they can then be prepared for life after approval.
Absolutely. So at a very basic level, the FDA expects and the company affirms from 99% of the marketing approvals, clearances, de novo grantings, that a quality management system is in place. And the best thing that someone can do is to ensure that a robust quality management system is activated the minute you get that 510K. And that will require typically at a minimum a quality manager that could be outsourced still. And working shoulder to shoulder with that quality manager is a regulatory manager or director, because there will inevitably be changes in the device and post-market activities mandated to process feedback, evaluate complaints, monitor and classify those complaints for potential recalls. These are all classic post-market activities. And I've described a few processes and the personnel that need to be in place for life after that 510K de novo or PMA. And we work with dental companies in that phase, companies in a range of product areas who wanted an outsourced director of regulatory or regulatory and quality once their product got launched. I do believe that this is fundamentally a team sport that requires a long view and a focus on accessing the right talent at the right time based on the needs of the company to get to that meaningful milestone. So if you think of this as a sport with 9 endings, and if you're early stage, you're maybe in inning number 1 or number 2, but the goal is to get to that next inning to make that meaningful milestone, get fuel in the tank, capital to keep going and ultimately serve patients. You can keep that focus and that framework, I think you'll be in good stead.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise, Kwame. I'm looking forward to touching base with you again soon as times continue to evolve at the FDA for an update. But I really appreciate you taking the time, sharing your insights and wisdom with myself and the founders that will be watching this.
Oh, thank you, AJ.